Good afternoon. Hello. My name is Catherine Geddick-Soltis, and I'd just like to welcome you all here to this second lecture in a series of the relevance of the Franciscan tradition. It's celebrating the 800th anniversary of the founding of the Order, the Franciscan Order, and it's sponsored by the Office of Mission and Ministry and the Center for Peace and Justice Education. So we are particularly honored this afternoon to be able to host a very extremely accomplished speaker, Father Ken Himes. He's a leading scholar in social ethics and comes to us from Boston College there. And I can tell you there's much excitement when he arrived to take the helm of the department. But as for me, I was particularly pleased since BC was not only welcoming a top-notch theologian, but also there would finally be a Franciscan presence among the Jesuits. So that was a great solace to me. Father Himes was solemnly professed as a Franciscan in the Orders of Friars Minor in 1975 and was ordained a priest the following year. BC's gain was at the expense of Washington Theological Union, however, where Father Himes had served as professor of moral theology for over 20 years before making his move up to Boston. Father Himes received his bachelor's degree in history from Siena College, his master's in moral theology from Washington Theological Union, and his doctorate in religion and public policy from Duke University. He has been a fellow at the Center for Theological Inquiry in Princeton, New Jersey, and has held the Paul McKeever Chair of Moral Theology at St. John's University in New York. Father Himes is editor of the journal New Theology Review and is a past president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. He's published nearly 60 articles in scholarly and popular journals, 40 reviews, written more than 20 chapters in various edited books, and has authored 2 books, Responses to 101 Questions on Catholic Social Teaching, and co-authored with his brother, Father Michael Himes, Fullness of Faith, The Public Significance of Theology. Fullness of Faith was awarded Best Theology Book by the Catholic Press Association in 1993. Father Himes has also edited 2 other volumes, Introduction to Christian Ethics, A Reader, and most recently, from Georgetown University Press, Modern Catholic Social Teaching, Commentaries and Interpretations in 2005. And this volume was named the Best Reference Book by the Catholic Press Association in 2006. Father Himes has given countless workshops and presentations on Catholic social teaching, faith and politics, Catholic moral theology, globalization, and peace building. He has served as a consultant to the National Conference of Catholic Bishops for their pastoral letter, The Challenge of Peace, and for several years was a regular presenter for the Department of Social Development and World Peace of the United States Catholic Conference. Father Himes is an expert on Catholic social thought, Christianity and politics, and ethical issues of war and peace. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to him tonight as he speaks to us on Franciscan traditions of peacemaking.
If Catherine will give me my talk back, I will.
I thought you memorized.
You can have it afterwards. But well, good afternoon, everybody. Nice to be with you. Might as well get the first thing out of the way. The first question a lot of people ask me is, how does a Franciscan wind up the chair of theology at Boston College? And the answer really is, depends who you talk to. The Franciscans all think I'm doing missionary work, and the Jesuits think they're doing affirmative action. So you make of it what you will. Let me thank the people here at Villanova, all of you for coming, but also all those responsible for this lecture series. As Catherine mentioned, this is in 1209, Francis received approval to begin his or to accept this kind of loose community of brothers who had gathered around him outside of Assisi in a small area called Rivo Torto, where they first began to live a community life and to work with the poor. And they called themselves the Fratres Minores, the lesser brothers. And as I'll try to explain, I think both those terms are very significant for understanding peacemaking in the Franciscan tradition. Both minores, lesser, and fratres, brother. One of the responses to the terror attacks of September 11, 2001, was an international assembly of religious leaders that was convened by John Paul II. On January 24th, 2002, just a few months after the attack, almost 200 leaders of 12 different world religious traditions met in Assisi, Italy, to pray for peace. Assisi, the home of St. Francis, had been the host city for the first day of prayer, held on October 27th, 1986. 16 years later, people representing all manner of religious traditions returned to the city of Francis, in the words of the Pope, as pilgrims for peace, among people from such a diverse background. I think the first reason is his fraternal outlook on creation. In my remarks, I'm going to begin with a reflection on this fraternal worldview of Francis, or what may be termed in Catholic teaching a communitarian perspective, a community-based perspective. Then I will comment on the meaning of peace and conclude with some thoughts on the relationship of peace to the themes of justice, solidarity, participation, and the option for the poor. And throughout my remarks, I'm going to treat Franciscanism as not as an independent tradition, but really more a matter of emphasis within the broader Catholic tradition. So let me begin. The vision of Francis. Among the facets of Francis of Assisi, one that is not so widely known for this well-known saint is his role in the story of Italian poetry. The case can be made that Francis was the first poet to write in the vernacular, the first to use Italian rather than the Latin language. His great poem, the Canticle of Creation, offers an insight into his worldview. Francis was convinced of the unity of all creatures. And in his poem, he addressed the sun and the moon, the earth and the air, fire and water, his own body, animals and plants, as brothers and sisters. Now, this should not simply be seen as some poetic license, because it reflects a very deep conviction of Francis, that all creatures are united in the depth of their being by the very fact of being a creature. That is, for Francis, the truth of creatureliness, the truth of being a creature, is the reality that nothing must exist. All of creation is contingent. Nothing need be out of necessity. Creatures cannot call themselves into existence, nor can we sustain ourselves in existence. If we exist, it is by grace. There is simply no necessity that you and I be. This is the truth that unites all creatures. Francis addressed other creatures as brothers and sisters because he saw that we all share, by virtue of being creatures, something that is greater than anything that distinguishes us from one another. We are all equal by virtue of being dependent on God for our existence. None of us is capable of existence on our own. To acknowledge the iffiness of our creation, the contingency of our being, that has driven some people into despair, seeing no point then to creation. For Francis, however, the non-necessity of existence led him to praise God, who created not out of need, but out of love. For Francis, the simple reason why anything exists is because it is loved into existence by God. To recognize one's total dependence upon God's free gift of creation, therefore, is to understand that at the foundation of everything is grace. Consequently, Francis invites, quote, all peoples, races, tribes, and tongues, all nations and all peoples everywhere on earth to love the Lord God, unquote, and to recognize that all is a gift from a most gracious God who is the supreme good. Now you see, it's this equality of creatureliness is what inspires Francis to see other creatures as sisters and brothers. And this approach can explain one of the most dramatic moments in the life of Francis: his meeting with the Sultan during the Fifth Crusade in 1219. I happen to notice that the most recent issue of Commonweal actually has this incident as a cover story, Francis's meeting with the Sultan. The setting, it's 1219. The Pope has called for a Fifth Crusade after the debacle of the Fourth Crusade, in which the Crusaders sacked Constantinople, the center of Eastern Christianity, looking for payment. Francis, along with many others, went on this Fifth Crusade not as a member of the military force, but as a pilgrim who actually opposed the violence of war. When Francis arrived near the city of Damietta, which was at the mouth of the Nile, he and another friar crossed over the river from the Crusaders' side to the side that was under the control of what was then called the Saracens, which is simply the Arabic word for Easterners. Initially, Francis was handled roughly, beaten, and bound. But despite the language gap, Francis somehow managed to convey that he was on a mission of peace. Eventually, and no record exists as to just how he did this, but somehow Francis was able to wrangle a personal audience with the Sultan of Egypt, Malik al-Kamil, who was the leader of the Saracen forces battling with the Crusaders. What we do know is that Francis impressed the Sultan enough that he was invited to stay on as a guest of the Egyptian leader for some time. They met regularly, along with several Muslim religious teachers who accompanied the Sultan. And they engaged in serious, respectful, even friendly debate, we're told. When Francis returned to Assisi the next year in 1220, he brought with him the one gift he accepted from the Sultan, who had tried to give him many things. The one gift was a horn that the Muslim prayer leaders used to summon their followers to their daily times of prayer. Francis was so impressed by the Muslim custom of prayer at certain intervals of the day that he used to blow the horn as he walked through the towns of Umbria in Italy, calling people to join him in prayer. Now, what's remarkable in this story, I'd like to suggest, is not that somehow Francis stopped the Fifth Crusade in its tracks. He didn't. The killing went on. Rather, it is Francis's seemingly simple commitment to seeing the Sultan as a fellow creature, a brother who was also loved into existence by God. Now you have to remember, the propaganda war against the Saracens was extreme. They were seen as barbarians. They were seen as desecrating the Holy Land and the shrines of the Holy Land. They were seen as persecuting Christian pilgrims. They were seen to threaten the very existence of European Christendom. Hatred and fear of the Saracens in the Middle Ages was far greater than anything we think and feel about the Taliban or Al-Qaeda today. The motto of the Crusades was Deus Vult, God wills it. Now one might imagine Francis, a devout Catholic, therefore, a man totally committed to the truth of the gospel, such a person could have easily been brought to anger by reports of the Saracens attacking fellow Christians. But that was not Francis's response. Instead, Francis never wavered from his conviction that the leader of the Saracens, who were called the enemies of the cross of Christ, that was the standard description of them. Francis never wavered from the conviction that the Sultan was his brother. It is this bedrock stance that the other is not a threat, but a creature loved by God, that provides the foundation for an ethic of Franciscan peacebuilding. So much of the psychology of war is aimed at dehumanizing the enemy, turning the other into a threat who must be extinguished. Indeed, such a process of denying the standing of the other is necessary for most warriors to use violence against others. After all, it is extremely difficult to kill the parent of a small child. It's very difficult to destroy the only child of an elderly widow, or to take the life of a spouse leaving behind a grieving partner. But killing the enemies of the cross of Christ, or taking the life of barbarians, or shooting Nazis, or commies, or terrorists, that at least becomes thinkable. But Francis would have none of the psychology of war in the Crusades, because to him it denied the fundamental viewpoint which shaped his entire life. That we are all equal in God's eyes by virtue of being creatures called into existence by the same God. It is this fraternal and sororal vision, looking at people as brothers and sisters in Franciscanism, that I think finds resonance with the broader Catholic tradition's communal perspectives. The root metaphor for the Catholic communal vision is the biblical emphasis on covenant. For the devout Jew, the belief that Yahweh had initiated a relationship with the descendants of Abraham was the touchstone of their existence. The conviction that the Jewish people had a unique relationship to the Lord of history was fundamental to Hebrew identity. That identity evolved over time, over centuries, as Israel's understanding of its role developed. The various ways of thinking about the covenant relationship reveals the emerging sensibility among the Jewish people that God's purpose is to establish in and through them a community of all creation. The Hebrew Bible's message of covenant community gets extended both in its universality and its particularity by the New Testament's understanding of the early church. Portrayals of the early Christian community in the Acts of the Apostles and the various epistles of the New Testament suggest a strong emphasis on community. Later writers in the post-apostolic and the patristic periods also presume the centrality of community to a proper understanding of gospel living. It is through the community of disciples that a universal message of salvation and liberation will be heard. This communal perspective or worldview is evident in the way that Catholicism understands certain goods. In the case of peace, the characteristic outlook will be seen in the conviction that it is through the creation of communities embodying certain specific conditions that peace will come to be established. Almost everything that Franciscanism and Catholicism have to say about peace building flows from the principle that peace is positive, not negative. What I mean by that is, peace understood negatively is a remainder concept. If you subtract violence from a situation, what's left over is peace. That's the negative view of peace. Peace, in other words, is simply the absence of war. That negative understanding is commonly found in popular conversations. When the shooting stops and active hostilities end, we say there is peace. However, peace in the positive sense is a rich, multi-dimensional reality. This positive peace is found in the Hebrew sense of shalom. The ancient Hebrews saw peace as entailing an abundance of life. It's what happens when people live within good communities. There is a sense of well-being, of having economic, social, familial, religious, and political dimensions. Biblically, true peace, the ideal of shalom, meant having the conditions for human beings to flourish within communities that were put in place for all to enjoy. So when the biblical authors speak of something like peace, they are including far more than just the realm of politics. In one sense, peace has to do with being in relationship with God, knowing and dwelling within God's love. To be at peace with God is to dwell as one with God, but also all that God loves. And since God loves all things into existence, to be at peace is to live in harmony and in love with all one's brothers and sisters. Talking about this positive view of peace reasserts the very traditional view that peace is the consequence of justice. This suggests that creating peace entails establishing certain essential freedoms, securing certain basic goods, promoting certain significant relationships, and reforming social structures and social institutions so as to make justice effective. Thus, peace building is understood broadly as an array of activities that can be engaged in by a variety of actors working at various levels of society, all in a multi-dimensional project, building human communities. Before his encounter with the Sultan, there was another encounter that was even more significant for Francis. Francis was really a dreamer, and he was something of a romantic. And like many young men of his time, the romantic dreams were connected to an ideal of military glory. Francis, as a young man, participated in a conflict between Assisi and its arch rival, the city of Perugia, a few miles away. During the hostilities, he was taken captive, and, as was a common practice at the time between the Italian city-states, he was held hostage for about a year due to the ongoing hostilities, and then was ransomed by his family. While he was in prison awaiting release, he became ill. And after his freedom, he was sick for some time. Then, after recovering, Francis took up alms again, this time with even more elaborate and expensive preparation. He acquired new armor. He obtained a horse and new weapons. All of this was to answer the call of the Pope to defend the interests of the Church in Italy against the German forces of the Emperor. But while Francis was on his way to join the papal army, he had some sort of experience that led him to return home to Assisi. No doubt, to much embarrassment, having marched off in glory, going off to war, and then skulking back into town a few days later. And with raised eyebrows, he began to search for a new way of living. He took to wandering on foot or on his horse through the countryside outside the walls of Assisi. He made a pilgrimage to Rome, and he was generous in giving alms. But something was missing, and he had not yet found his way into a new life. Years later, in 1226, near his death, he related the narrative of the event that changed his life as a young man back then. He tells us that he was riding a horse in the woods when he came upon a leper. Francis recounts that as a young man, quote, "Nothing disgusted me like seeing victims of leprosy," unquote. Yet this time, after initially riding around and avoiding the leper on the path, Francis suddenly stops. He reverses his field and returns to the leper. There he dismounts, and then he embraces the leper and kisses him. After giving the leper some money, Francis got back on his horse and rode about 2 miles to the nearest leprosarium, which he entered and then proceeded to speak with and embrace all of the inmates. Looking back on this experience, Francis wrote, quote, "The Lord himself led me among them, and I showed mercy to them. And when I left them, what had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body," unquote. Francis's embrace of poverty, choosing to live on the margins of society from this point onwards, was at least in part a calculated strategy, because he wanted to live in union with the outcasts of his day. His poverty was an attempt at compassionate identification with the people whom society looked down upon. Today, we would use the word solidarity to describe what Francis was about here. From this point on in his life, Francis would describe his encounter with the leper on the road as the beginning of his life. Today's lepers, of course, are those people who suffer brutal and inhuman conditions at the mercy of the powerful, who exercise influence over the economic and political institutions of our society and globe. Dehumanizing injustice can be fertile soil in which violence and hatred grow. Francis was convinced that hatred and violence must be overcome by compassionate solidarity that accepts those who are marginalized and includes them within the community of life. Francis knew that power and force do not announce peace anywhere near as effectively as justice and solidarity do. In one of his conversations with God, Francis talked about wealth and weapons as inextricably intertwined. Quote, Lord, speaking of himself and his community, Lord, if we had possessions, we would need arms to protect them, because they cause many disputes and lawsuits. And possessions usually impede the love of God and of neighbor. Therefore, we do not want to possess anything, unquote. My colleague at Boston College, Lisa Cahill, has argued that what is most difficult in creating a global ethic today is the issue of solidarity, not the issue of knowing the good for the human person. That is, what Lisa is saying is that what prevents our building a better world is often not because we lack data or we lack strategies for action, but rather we lack the desire to pursue the good at the expense of convenience and narrow self-interest. Solidarity is a willed commitment to seek the best interests of the other is the needed component in the work of building peace. Solidarity is the energy that drives people to view the welfare of the other as a desirable good. It leads people to take responsibility, not only for their own well-being, but for the welfare of others. Solidarity, as the movement from distrust and inequality that divides to collaboration and service that unites, is the path both to justice and to peace, according to Catholic teaching. It fosters a commitment to build communities wherein people can attain authentic development. It also moves people away from an experience of interdependence that can be exploitative or ridden with resentment. And it moves them to an interdependence that builds harmonious relations between people that are mutually satisfying. Peace, from this perspective, is the outgrowth of a certain kind of independence, a solidaristic interdependence, and a particular vision of human flourishing, that human beings live well when they live in community. An important point to note here is that solidarity is not understood primarily as a call to sacrifice, but rather as a real good that gives rise to hope. To use Francis's language, it is not bitter, but sweet. Recognizing community as an essential condition of human beings means that the call to solidarity is not fundamentally a call to self-denial, but rather it's a call for the opportunity to experience authentic self-realization through self-giving. The call to solidarity in Franciscan spirituality is an invitation to deepen what is best in the human person, our capacity to enter into mutually rewarding relationships by forging bonds of communion. It is to enact the fraternal and sororal vision of Francis in the belief that active solidarity can promote an international order that makes peace possible. In the way that the tradition speaks of justice, development, solidarity, and ultimately peace, it is evident that the communal perspective inflects the tradition's interpretation of these terms. Understood this way, Francis, like the broader Catholic tradition, presents peace as a positive task. It is something to be built rather than the simple result of war's absence. This, I think, is the fundamental insight of the tradition as it relates to peace building. That the work of peace is pluriform. It admits of a wide range of tasks and projects. Whatever activities engage human beings in collaborative efforts to create communities that promote authentic human development this is rightly considered peace building. Two further points about the nature of the communities that build peace. Social life is not something added onto the solitary individual, but rather it's a reality that is necessary for the proper development of the human person. If social life is essential to human development, then all people have both a right and a duty to contribute to community. Depending on the realm of social life, different forms of participation are appropriate. In economic life, the ability to be an active worker, to contribute to the community's well-being, is a typical exercise of participation. Such work usually permits one also to be a consumer of goods that are part of the common benefit of life in society. In matters of culture, rights of free expression and free association will often be a way to participate in the life of community. Politics, being the arena of power and decision-making, suggests that participation here entails a measure of self-determination, both at the individual and group level. The aspiration to participation is a basic drive within human beings as they seek human development. It is the legitimate wish to share responsibility for decisions that shape our lives individually and collectively. While the forms of participation will vary due to the changes of context, there is a fundamental ideal to which we are appealing here, namely, a broad inclusion of people in sharing both the benefits and the burdens of life together. Consequently, we should acknowledge a right to participation as a basic human right. The denial of this right, that is, to be excluded from community or to exclude others from community, is a serious injustice that we name marginalization. It is morally wrong to deny a person the opportunity to participate in communal life, thereby frustrating their authentic human development. Marginalization, however, may occur not solely because of a consciously willed decision to exclude someone. There often are social conditions within a society that effectively frustrate participation, even if no particular individual agent of exclusion is obvious. For example, a seriously subpar educational system can set people on a trajectory that makes their later participation as adults in the economy or the political process very difficult. Indeed, frequently the obstacles to participation are more institutional and systemic than directly traceable to personal ill will. Nonetheless, the right to participation is denied an individual. One danger to the vitality of a group is the choice of an inadequate standard of measurement for determining common life. And here we see the importance of Francis's experience with the lepers. It is a lived experience of what theologians today have come to call the option for the poor. This theme runs throughout Francis's life, hence the idea of lesser brothers, not just brothers. It suggests that any fair assessment of a society or a community must include whether the least well-off are able to be contributing members of the community and beneficiaries of the community. When applied to political life, the domain of power and decision-making, an option for the poor shapes the meaning of participation. In short, the test of participation is to be applied to those most marginalized from the sources of power. We must always ask, who is the marginalized in the community? What is the size of this group? What is the extent of their marginalization? The themes of participation and the option for the poor shape a discussion of peace building in several ways. Among the necessary building blocks for peace is a process of peace that is inclusive. Peace building cannot be the work of elites alone, people working at levels of high diplomacy and national decision-making. The involvement of participants at the grassroots level is also vital. Among the reasons for this is the need to create self-investment in a peace process. Peace is a challenge that must be met and actively sought. It is not a reward that can be given to others or simply handed to them. Peace cannot be won for others. It demands the activities of those in conflict to become agents of peace. The idea of participation speaks directly to the kind of inclusive process that peace must involve. Participation also suggests that a source of ongoing conflict is the lack of self-determination that many people experience. When people are excluded from a role in decision-making on matters that affect their well-being, it creates resentments that fester. While additional research is necessary here, there are a number of studies that suggest the risk of violent conflict is lessened when the conflict involves democratic nations. Besides war prevention, participation is crucial in post-conflict efforts at reconciliation. When groups are excluded from post-conflict peace building, they can become disruptive opponents of conflict resolution because they see themselves as having little to gain from the end of conflict. To employ the insight of the option for the poor in the work of peace building means that peace building must include the voices, the perspectives, the experiences of those often overlooked in the work of creating peace. In conflict situations, the option for the poor really means the option for victims. Victims of the conflict, members of the defeated army, widows and orphans, minority groups or ethnic groups that are minorities. These are characteristically the marginalized people after conflict. A satisfactory approach to peace building must be attentive to those who would be excluded due to bitterness or harsh feeling after a conflict. Essentially, the themes of participation and the option for the poor underscore the importance of grassroots activity in building peace. Now, Francis of Assisi was not a philosopher or a theologian. He was not a person, really, with an analytic mind, nor was he given to systematic theory. He was more the poet than the scholar, more the artist than the educator. Therefore, I have tried to focus on his vision of peace as embodied in his experience rather than analyze his writings. The encounter with the leper early in his adult life and the one with the Sultan about a decade and a half later reflect that vision. Peace is more than the absence of war. Peace requires sensitivity to the dignity of the other, even the other who may at times appear to be a threat. Peace is the result of building communities that are characterized by justice, solidarity, participation, and attention to the least well-off. Let me end then with a final caution about the hard work that is peace building. For the way of peace is really the way of the cross. Throughout his life, Francis strove, quote, to observe the holy gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, unquote. More specifically, Francis's life and prayer flowed from what he was willing to embrace, the way of the cross. One of Francis's own prayers to Christ begins, "Let me experience your suffering on the cross, and let me experience the love in your heart that allowed you to endure the cross." Francis knew that it was only through the cross, that is, through selfless confrontation with suffering, alienation, and evil, that God's goodness will prevail. The building of peace requires love in the form of the cross. He urged his followers, quote, "Lift up your bodies and carry his holy cross and follow his commands to the end," unquote. Francis's mystical experience so enabled him to identify with the crucified Christ that he received the stigmata at the end of his life. That is, the 5 wounds of Christ on the cross were impressed upon his own body. Francis was transformed into a living sign of Christ's humble, poor, self-giving love on the cross. The stigmata symbolizes that the gospel life of peace is not possible without suffering and death. That is, to live without dying is to die without having lived. A willingness to die to self for the sake of others. This is the message of Jesus Christ and all the holy men and women of the world's great religious traditions. Francis of Assisi lived that truth intensely. Crucified love is the root of peace, and peace is the result of love that bears the cross. Thank you.
We have time for some questions and comments. Do you want me to field them?
Sure.
I invite you to let us know who you are.
We've lulled them into complacency.
It's very peaceful.
There's an absence of conflict. But it doesn't mean peace.
Well, our community is bond with conversation here, so.
Paul Sheldon, I'm in the Psychology Department. By the way, much of what you say resonates to me as a Quaker pacifist, and also associated here with Villanova for Peace. And how does some of their, and the Franciscans are the closest, if I can say this among various Catholics to my heart, but how does this resonate with some Jesuits and just war people? And it's a bit of a, there aren't a heck of a lot of pacifists, and yet I say Jesus was a pacifist.
It's a good, very good question, Paul. I think what one would have to say is that the dispute between Francis and even some of his later followers, who are not pacifist or would not endorse absolute pacifism, even if they accept nonviolence as the ideal, say. I think the dispute comes down to the question of the conflicting obligations of loving the neighbor. That is, I think most followers of Francis would be uncomfortable with any sort of blanket endorsement of war or blanket endorsement of any national security doctrines that assert a nation's self-interest above all others. But I think there also would be a recognition that there may at least at times be situations where it's unclear what love of neighbor demands when perhaps one comes upon a scene or a setting in which it appears that third parties are inflicting violence on others who are innocent, and one may have the ability to intervene, prevent that, cease that from occurring in some way. So this is a very, sort of parochial example of a much larger question. But is it wrong for police officers to employ violent force to prevent someone from attacking an innocent person? Is it wrong for people to ever use violent force to prevent genocide on a larger scheme? Because those questions are there and are not, it seems to me, self-evidently resolved one way or the other, you're going to have to, I think, acknowledge that there's going to be some pluralism of responses to those kinds of conflict situations. So because of that, I think, the Franciscan vision has to acknowledge it's a vision, but it doesn't exhaust the full range of possible responses within the Christian tradition. And I do think, Menno Simons, the founder of the Mennonites, was a Franciscan. Had left the Franciscans, but came with that background and that spirituality. So I do think there's a kind of clearly an affinity of the Franciscan vision with nonviolence and with a political stance of pacifism. But I wouldn't say it's might say self-evident that or logical that it must in every and all cases. I think, I don't disagree that there are people who, in good faith and in accepting the goodness of others, still recognize that there are conflicts in which at times some intervention that may entail violence may be necessary in order to prevent greater harm, such as humanitarian interventions in the case of, say, genocide or something like that. Not easy to pull off, not trying to make a case for any particular one, but just to say, at least in principle, I think it's discussable and debatable.
Can I only note that the range for the statement of pacifist for myself and I know some are totally nonviolent, but for many of us that means no participation in war. But I think sharing, there are bad people out there, should we call them sinners, and for them, I can support a well-organized police force.
Yeah.
But going to war is what I hear Francis say you could not do.
I think that's right.
Because those people are forced into it in almost all cases.
That's right. I think that's right. Yeah.
Above all, Ken, it's this notion of the vision that flows from his experience, which gives him direction. And it seems one of the things that emerges out of this context also is to look for the possibility for other options. He walked into the Saracen base, and so is this not? It is a vision that there's some, and a hope that there's something other. But I think oftentimes today we either there's so much focused on the need to confront the injustice rather than to explore alternative possibilities for dealing with the situation. And I think, at least to me, Francis inspires the possibility of at least let's look at other options before. We always know we can confront, but are there other possible ways of dealing with diffusing the conflict and bringing about a better communal response?
I think that touches on some of Paul's things as well, and I think that's right, Barbara. Again, I've never seen Francis or understood him as a sort of like wise philosopher. It's not the way he thinks. He's not a systematic thinker, or even particularly theoretical thinker. Francis was very much a kind of occasional thinker that reflected on experiences, and the poet is there. And I think because of that, the drive to creativity, the refusal to simply say, all right, someone has defined the options as A, B, and C. Francis was always one of those people to say, well, is there a D, E, and F out there somewhere? He was a person who would seem to me who tried to transform contexts rather than simply let the context define him. And so there was that those elements. One of the best things I ever heard about Francis was, I remember years, this is when I was the age of some of the people in this room. But I remember hearing a lecture in which a fellow man named Conrad Hawkins, who was a really wise Franciscan scholar, he was asking the question, why is it that Francis was so beloved? In the sense of, there's no record, absolutely no record of anyone who was Francis's enemy. Even people he disagreed with within the order in time, and people he may have disagreed with outside the order, he'd have disagreements, and Francis was upfront about his views on things, but no one seemed to hate Francis or have any kind of enmity towards Francis, even when he disagreed with them or challenged them, whatever. And we got this conversation going about, well, why is that? What is it about Francis that he never inspired anger or hatred or fear in people? And this guy's response always struck me as wise. He said, the real reason was, even though Francis disagreed with you or whatever it was, no one ever feared that Francis was going to work his will upon another person against theirs. That is, you might know where Francis stood, and it might be in opposition to you, but you never had to stand there worrying, is he going to ram this down my throat? Is he going to coerce me into this? Is he going to impose this upon me? That Francis never threatened anyone. And it was that allowed people to hear him, even when he was challenging them and disagreeing with them, but they knew that his challenges or disagreements would only be invitations to reconsider or rethink things. They were not going to be the prelude to, and now I'm going to make you do it. And I think there is something of that there again with this point about creativity. Francis would do some crazy things. I mean, you look at Francis' life, this is not a life that you would recommend to your children to live. I mean, you'd be embarrassed by them. Francis was something of a street artist. I mean, the scene of when he has this disagreement with his father early in his life, and he strips himself nude in the middle of the town and gives his father back his clothes and says, I owe you nothing anymore. I mean, this is not the way most parents want to see their relationship with their child go, But what's going on here is some real street theater. I mean, Francis is engaging in dramatic actions, not in the sense of, and everyone else should do this, but it's engaging in dramatic actions to sort of make people sort of like wake up and think about, well, what are my relationships with my parents, and do my parents have claims against my conscience when my conscience tells me something else? It was deliberately meant to be a kind of provocative act that induces reflection. So Francis can do some things that strike us as odd and unusual and not necessarily something you want everybody else to model. But I think it's all ways that he's trying to kind of push the envelope. And he's trying to expand people's ways of thinking, ways of considering things, ways of moving beyond the ordinary taken for granted world. G.K. Chesterton has a little book about Francis of Assisi. Chesterton was a British author in the first half of the 20th century. And he calls it a biography, but it's really not a biography of St. Francis. It's more Chesterton's kind of musings on the life of Francis. And one of the reflections he has is that Francis used to go up into the hills around the city of Assisi, which was a walled medieval fortress city, heavy stone walls walled in the city within. Francis used to go outside of Assisi and go up into the mountains and looking across the valley at the city of Assisi. And Chesterton talks about how Francis was influenced by the medieval troubadour tradition and influenced by that romantic poets and the like. And he talks about how Francis would do tumbling. And in doing tumbling, he'd see the world upside down. And then all of a sudden, one day Francis is looking at Assisi upside down, and this heavy, walled, stone city, everything is thick, heavy stone, even now when you see Assisi, perched on this hill, that this city that looks so solid and strong and massive, you see it upside down, and now its mass and its weight, its size is actually making it imperiled, that it's actually hanging over the abyss just by a thread. And that Francis sees the world that way, and all of a sudden he sees the city of Assisi as what's keeping Assisi going. And it goes back to this vision of the only thing that sustains it in existence is God. It's God that holds a CZ in existence. And it is this sense of that all of life is constantly dependent upon God sustaining life. So for Francis, it's a line actually comes later, not from Francis, but I think it summarizes Francis well. Actually comes from Aquinas, Catherine's friend. But it's a line of Aquinas. What does God have to do for the world to end? And Aquinas' answer was, God doesn't have to do anything for the world to end. God has to stop doing something. And what God has to stop doing is holding all of existence in life. And I think it's that kind of seeing the world differently, seeing it upside down, looking at it differently. That's what I mean by his poetic vision. You listen to a poet, and a poet describes a sunset a lot different than I do. A poet has an experience, and they can lay it out and get an insight to it much better than people like me who talk in prose. So part of this is the creativity and the insight that someone like Francis brings to a situation that allows you to think of alternatives. Not all of us can pull that off. Yes?
I'm Heather, and I'm a junior here. Along the lines of expanding ways of thought, I couldn't help but wonder how St. Francis would have taken to having Galileo's daughter, for instance, living at one of the convents that he helped found. And I mean, Galileo was such a prominent astronomer, mathematician of the time, and yet the Catholic Church had problems with him. So I kind of wonder how St. Francis would have, do you have any ideas?
Well, I suspect, when Francis would talk with his, and he has this right in the rule of life, the Franciscans, he talk about what do you do with the friar who doesn't live the life he professes to live? How does one deal with that person? And Francis writes a letter to what he called the ministers provincial. That is, the order grew so rapidly, so quickly. I mean, in Francis's own lifetime, the order has already gone well beyond Italy. There are friars who have already gone to China and India. There are permanent friaries in Ireland and in England and in France. The order just spreads like topsy, even in Francis's own short life. And what they did was, in order to facilitate communications and organization, originally, how the order ran when it was just in Italy was, all the friars met. They'd all come together once a year, they'd have a big meeting in Assisi, they'd be sleeping on the ground outside, and they'd have this kind of big jamboree in which Francis would walk with them, and okay, we got our way of thinking, let's go back to where we are. That becomes impractical at a certain point. And they divide the order into provinces, regional provinces, and he appoints a minister to each province. That is somebody who's meant to be the servant to the province, and that's what he considers the leader, the person who's the minister provincial, the minister to the province. And in his letter to the ministers as to how they ought to deal with the recalcitrant friar or the difficult friar or whatever, what he emphasizes is you must bring them to live with you and you must talk to them, and no friar should ever see in your face anything but forgiveness rather than anger. And he encourages them to sort of understand that their role is not to be meting out punishment. Their role really is to help that friar sort of regain the vision, So, my guess would be, again, Francis would not be somebody who would engage Galileo at the level of intellect. He wouldn't even try, But what Francis would probably do is he'd try to engage Galileo person to person and try to understand who Galileo is, what he's about, how he sees the situation, why he takes the stances he does. I think what you'd find is, a view towards the way you work with people is by engaging them rather than sort of disciplining them necessarily or punishing them, certainly. So I don't know that I can tell you, here's exactly what you do, but I think the style would be not to reach for the, the bull of excommunication. It would be more to extend the letter of invitation, come live with me and talk.